The topic is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and we're talking to Dr. Lewis V. Baldwin from Vanderbilt University. Dr. Baldwin, before we end this show for today, let's give you an opportunity to bring in some additional information dealing with the Civil Rights Act, and then later to sort of point us in some direction as to where we might be able to go from here. Let's use the entire period to do that.
Okay, before the commercial break, we were talking about the fact that the provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 have not really been actualized or realized or translated into public policy solutions. I think in 1965 we needed the Voting Rights Act because part of the provisions of the Civil Rights Act had not been fulfilled. If you look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, you'll notice that one aspect of it dealt with voting. But there were no specific guidelines about how people should register, about how the government should monitor voting activity and that kind of thing. So we needed the Civil Rights Act of 1965. Had to be added as another piece of civil rights legislation. When Dr. King was killed, before he was killed in 1968, he made a comment about all of these pieces of legislation, and he put the responsibility for the failure of these pieces of legislation on the federal government, because he felt that it's one thing to adopt, to introduce, to pass civil rights legislation. It's quite another to provide the resources for the implementation of these pieces of civil rights legislation. So we're dealing with that problem of legacy, as Dr. King raised it, with respect to civil rights legislation.
And so the resources are not there, even now, in terms of now. How would you bring this whole question that we have dealing with affirmative action and quotas and et cetera? Is that really considered to be part of the civil rights legacy movement? I mean, how would you put that in?
I would say the Civil Rights Act of 1964 certainly contributed to this. You speak of affirmative action, you speak of quotas, you speak of reparations, what Dr. King once called compensatory measures. I think you have to see it in relationship to what happened in 1964 with the Civil Rights Bill. But the fact that these particular issues are still being raised in 2004, 40 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, tells us something. And that is that for some reason we have not been able to resolve the problems surrounding civil rights, surrounding economic justice, surrounding equal opportunity and social justice in our society. Somehow or another, we are still wrestling with the same problem.
Now, would you suggest that when we think in terms of economic justice, that it took us almost 40 years to deal with what might be considered the most important elements, and that's public accommodation and voting rights and et cetera, and now we've only had an opportunity now to get around to dealing with Title VI and some of the other aspects of it, and that it might be time to deal with those particular aspects of it.
Well, what we have come to see over the last 40 years is that even though the Civil Rights Act of 1964 guaranteed job opportunities, equal employment opportunities, education, that if you don't have the financial resources, it doesn't mean much. You can have equal opportunity, but equal access to restaurants, hotel, educational institutions, but if you don't have the money or the resources to find your place in these institutions, then it becomes problematic. And the '64 Civil Rights Act did not address that. The problem of economic inequality and the lack of economic empowerment, not only in black communities, but in other minority communities and among women as well.
And so are you suggesting that we might be able to generate a new push in terms of civil rights, to recognize that the law is there, but there has to be some other kind of method toward enforcing those laws?
Yeah, I also think that the political climate today, in 2004, will make necessary a revisitation of some of this civil rights legislation, and also a push for the advancement of new civil rights legislation. We see today, and I think we'll continue to see, an erosion of affirmative action guidelines. We will see an attacks on civil rights legislation of the past, attacks on civil rights, and these kinds of things will occur given the conservative political climate that we find ourselves in today. So I think you're right in saying that we will need to revisit much of this history of civil rights legislation, while at the same time looking toward the possibility of enhancing this kind of legislation in the future.
You know, I think Title VI, and of course we will deal with Title VI as part of the civil rights discussion that we're having here.
Yeah.
But now, Title VI still provides for the federal government to intervene in a real positive way. Well, now, why is it that when we have laws, and the laws are quite explicit in terms of what ought to be done and et cetera, that there's a really non-enforcement of some of these laws? So explain that.
Yeah, I think you have to see it from the angle of lack of federal government enforcement. I think the federal government is largely responsible, once it puts these pieces of legislation in place, for the implementation of these pieces of legislation. And I think that's where the failure rests today. We're in a conservative political climate today, and I think that contributes, I think, to a lack of attention to these kinds of issues, and I think we will continue to confront that in the future.
Well, you know, Dr. Baldwin, we've got about 3 minutes here, and what I'd like to do now is to have you to make some statements in reference to, and to speak primarily, as we often try to do, to speak primarily to some of the younger people in terms of their responsibility, in terms of what they have to do in order to not only make the Civil Rights Act a reality, but in terms of improving their own lives as well as the lives of others.
As I said earlier, one of the provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 calls for improvement in educational opportunity and equality in educational opportunity. I think for young people today, they must make sure that they take advantage of these kinds of educational opportunities that have been provided over the last 4 decades because of civil rights legislation. Because if these opportunities are not taken into account or embraced, then somehow or another we fail.
And so there's still a real need for civil rights legislation. There's still a real need for resources that are available, and et cetera.
And there's still also a need for us as African Americans to demonstrate that not only that these pieces of legislation are needed, but that we're going to do our best to benefit from them once they are put in place. And that means taking advantage of opportunity once it is provided through civil rights legislation. Otherwise, our whole cause is meaningless.
You know, very soon we will celebrate, I think, this year, the Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday, and of course you have played a very, very significant role in terms of helping us to highlight that. But now, what would you say in terms of the upcoming celebration of Dr. Martin Luther? I mean, what should the attitude of individuals be in reference to this great celebration?
I think that given the fact that the next celebration is in '05, I think it would be great for us to think of King in relationship to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, because he was so instrumental in the introduction and passage of both of these pieces of civil rights legislation. So I think we need to remember him in that connection. Over the years, we've remembered him in connection with global issues, we remembered him in connection with affirmative action, economic issues. We've discussed him in relationship to the issues of violence and nonviolence. But I think the next celebration should be devoted to viewing him and celebrating him in relationship to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
And of course, that would be a great way to honor Dr. King in this upcoming celebration.
And also to rekindle our commitment to the fulfillment of these pieces of legislation.
Well, Dr. Baldwin, let me simply say over the last few seconds that we have here that we certainly appreciate you coming by and giving us that information about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but it only continues what you've done for us over the last many years.
Thank you.
You've given us so much excellent information, and you've sort of provided somewhat of a platform
Yes.
for us to have a real understanding on this particular show in reference to what the Civil Rights Act was all about, not only the act, but what civil rights has meant in the United States of America. And I think it's because of those efforts that we're able to talk about the progress that we've had.
Thank you.
And of course, let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.